Hello and welcome back to the Countering Climate Skepticism podcast. This is the podcast where we discuss and counter the arguments given by climate change skeptics and deniers. This podcast will explain the truth behind climate change and what is really going on. We aim to provide you with the facts and evidence to challenge any climate denial arguments you might come across. My name is John Rainier and I'm joined by my co-host Mark Prosser. It's been a while since we last released an episode. We took a hiatus as Mark's been finishing off his climate science PhD. I believe you've finally finished that now, Mark, haven't you? How's that gone?
It was a struggle towards the end, John, but I got it in.
I can imagine.
I think it was 12 minutes before the final deadline.
Oh, blimmin' heck.
I was there at 11:48 on a Sunday evening. And I just pulled an 18-hour stint and managed to get it in. I mean, I was like this back in the grammar school when we used to have the same classes together. Like, I was always a deadline hugger. And I've become a more careful deadline hugger, so I was able to, produce the goods by the absolute last minute. And I had done things in advance to ensure that would happen, but I was there 12 minutes before.
You've done things in advance to ensure that you managed to get it in with 12 minutes to go. Yeah.
You don't sound terribly convinced, John, but I swear it is a thing. Because if you just wait till, the last day of your PhD and have done no work for 4 years.
Yeah. Oh, no, of course.
Yeah, so there is, it's got to be feasible. Anyway, what are you talking about? You're a massive deadline hugger.
Yes, I did. Yeah. I did have to run in order to meet my deadline for my undergraduate dissertation. Yeah, so
there you go.
I can't make any criticism at all.
Exactly.
No comment.
Exactly. But it's in now and it's good. I have a Viva, which is the oral exam, in about a month. So I'm preparing for that.
Oh wow! And then officially, you can then call yourself Dr. Prosser.
Yeah, at some point, I believe you get a letter through the post at some point, and then it says, okay, from this date, you're allowed to use the doctor.
That's cool.
Yeah.
All right. So today we're going to cover the first of two of the level 6 arguments. So the idea that we're going to tackle today, if technology doesn't solve the problems caused by climate change, then we shouldn't wreck the economy to try and fix the problem. The second one we'll do next time or the time after that. If tech doesn't solve the problems, then we're doomed, but not today.
Yeah. So if tech doesn't solve problems, then we shouldn't wreck the economy to fix the problem. Level 6 on the Ziggurat, the top level now, or the first of two, as you said, John. So what are your thoughts if you encountered this line of reasoning down the pub?
Well, I think if we don't fix the climate problem, the economy is going to be far more wrecked in the future, and that it's only going to get worse. So we either fix it now or we have a bigger problem to fix in the future. Yeah,
exactly. I mean, that's a sort of a headline answer to that line of reasoning.
So what do you think then, Mark?
Yeah, so it's complicated in a way because, I suppose there's a two-way relationship. So there is a point to a degree, but I mean, ultimately, I concur with what you're saying, But I'll go into that a little bit more later. But I agree that the skeptics, depending on quite how they're using that argument, have things a bit backwards, or upside down even. So like I said, I think last episode, the upper levels of the Ziggurat, so 5 and 6, are a bit different to the batshit crazy lower levels of 1 and 2, and also different to the maybe a kernel of truth. Go take a long, hard look at yourself in the mirror. Intermediate levels of 3 and 4. The upper levels are somewhat more debatable, and it really depends on where the person is coming from who is making this argument. So for instance, with the level 5, which we did last time, technology will solve the problem. There's a reasonable way to take this, i.e. technology will play an important role in dealing with the climate crisis. Mm-hmm. And then there's a more denially unreasonable way. So technology will solve the problems for us, with the quiet bit being that therefore we don't need to do anything, which is obviously unreasonable.
Yeah.
Similarly, if you encounter level 6 down the pub, we shouldn't wreck the economy, you might ask yourself first, are arguing that we need to be mindful of the economic impacts of policy designed to address climate change? If they are, then sure, no problem there with me. If, on the other hand, they are essentially arguing that we shouldn't be pursuing any climate policy, and these people do exist, see the current UK Tory party for many, many examples, then I guess it's time to put on your countering hat, John.
Yeah, I've got mine with me at all times.
In your wallet.
Always whipping out my countering climate change hat. Yeah.
Yes. You've told me various stories before.
I think it says MAGA on it, to be honest.
Does it? Sure, it doesn't. You sure it doesn't say mega? Make Earth great again.
That's a good one. Yeah.
I actually have a mega hat.
Do you?
I stopped wearing it, but for a period I was like walking about with a mega hat. People didn't seem to find it as funny as I thought it would be, but never mind. Yeah. So the skeptic is worried about wrecking the economy. Any thoughts on what specifically they mean by that phrase here, John? Wrecking the economy. What's wrecking the economy?
I think maybe if we're prioritising climate reducing policies, that costs will go up for consumers, and meaning that they can afford less, so the economy will shrink overall. I think there's also concerns that the idea of continual growth, which is so prevalent in our economic systems, will be hampered by restrictions on coal, oil and gas, especially with relation to trade or the logistics of moving goods around.
And do you think they have a point at all with either of these? Or?
I think maybe in the short term, and I think unfortunately for those in a more financially vulnerable state, the immediate future is obviously a far more pressing concern. But I've got some good news stories that we'll go through at the end of the episode, and that will highlight that there's just some real flaws in that kind of thinking and those kind of arguments. So we'll address those later on.
Sure. Okay, I look forward to hearing that then.
So what do you think then? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I came up with 4 possible classes of economic impacts from climate policy, which the skeptics may be referring to when they say wrecking the economy. So number 1, job losses. For instance, people involved in coal mining will probably have to find employment elsewhere, seeming as we can't dig up and burn all the coal that there exists. 2, higher prices, which you mentioned there, John. Implementing a carbon tax or investing in renewables may well result in higher energy costs in the short term. 3, loss of competitiveness. So if, for example, one country is a goody two-shoes, I suppose, and implements a lot of good proactive climate policy, but others don't, then that country will likely suffer because it will have to bear costs and then it will be less competitive than its competitor. Number 4, carbon crunch. So if we come off fossil fuels at lightning pace, it is not impossible that we could inadvertently precipitate or contribute towards a global financial recession or worse.
Okay.
So in a nutshell, let me give you my responses to these 4 so you can see where I'm coming from. So job losses, number 1. If job losses happen, unlike after the miners' strike in the UK, help should be on hand to support these folk to reskill, to get jobs in other industries. It's also important to note that many green jobs will be created as wind turbines don't tend to erect themselves.
I'm sure there's a joke in there somewhere.
I thought about that. Couldn't quite figure it out though. But it's to listeners. I apologise. John and I were in an all-boys grammar school, and that has scarred us for life. Like this, the impact on our sense of humour will probably remain indefinite.
I don't know. I think there's quite widespread appreciation for an erection joke.
Yes, there is.
Moving on.
2, higher prices. Yes, energy prices may go up. Should they go up by a lot? No. Government should step in with subsidies until the costs come down after the initial investment is over. 3, loss of competitiveness. So this is a tricky one. And there's an economist called Helm who talks about this. I'll put a link in the show notes to a podcast episode where he talks about it quite compellingly. But groups like the EU have semi-decent climate policy, and there are mechanisms to guard against economic free riders. So in short, you don't have to be far, far out in front of the climate policy curve if you can't afford to be. But don't be a cynical laggard dragging behind either. And the latter is kind of more the case if you look at it in certain respects. 4, the carbon crunch argument. So at the pace we're going with greening the economy, I don't think many people are worried about this. Certainly not compared to 5 or 10 years ago. So I don't really think it's as strong an argument or one that we should be too concerned about. Any thoughts, John?
Yeah, it seems like there's some kind of broad parallels to nuclear disarmament, I guess, really. The idea that no country wants to be the one to go too far with it too quickly. You know, they feel they might appear weak compared to other countries or cause themselves a disadvantage by doing that.
Now that you mention it, John, I totally agree. There are distinct parallels. I guess we live in a world of nation states, and what may be good for the individual nation may not be good for us as a whole collectively. So it totally mirrors the climate crisis. This is, we live in a globalized world, and we have, global problems that need to be dealt with globally, but yet we're still sort of stuck in the nation state mindset to a large degree. And so this is maybe at the core of why, or one of the core reasons why dealing with climate change is difficult, in the way that dealing with nuclear proliferation is also difficult.
Yeah.
None of these problems are easy, that's for sure. Yeah, so to summarize, I'd say that, sure, dealing with the climate crisis will probably have an impact on the economy, sometimes even a challenging one. Should this be carefully managed? Of course. And a government who tried to implement an overly strong and fast green agenda without concern for the social and economic consequences would probably do enormous damage, and it would backfire anyway, probably. A bit like you with that climate board game you mentioned several episodes ago, John.
Yeah, for those of you who weren't aware, there's this climate board game we played where I managed to lose quite spectacularly as China. But, in my defence, I was just trying to live up to the communist ideal. I was just using the people as tools of the state. It's not my fault if they all rioted as a result of that.
Well, yes. Well, so was that the end result? They all rioted then, or?
Yeah, they all rioted because I was outsourcing all of my energy to other countries in order to improve the nation.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean,
so they just started dying, and they had an issue with that.
I hope you never become an authoritarian dictator, John. Just from these here conversations. I'm sure you'd be lovely.
A benevolent dictator, that's what I'd be.
Yeah. I mean, that's what all dictators think of themselves as, I guess. Okay, so we're saying that we're down with the reasonable version of level 6. However, the denially unreasonable version is unfortunately alive and kicking. And you often find folks trying to make out like they're the reasonable kind, when in fact they just want to kill any attempt at any climate policy to deal with the problem. And it's really annoying, John, because it's often the same folk who were arguing that climate change wasn't happening, level 1 of the Ziggurat, or that it was natural, level 2 of the Ziggurat, just a few years ago. As it's become more and more ridiculous to argue these things at the lower end, they've just tried to gain back some superficial credibility by shifting to the upper end of the Ziggurat, where it's more debatable. And maybe they've succeeded to a degree. Even more annoyingly, John, had we got moving earlier on climate change, had we got our arses into gear earlier, it would have been much cheaper and much, much easier to deal with, had such denialist obstructionism not been doing its level best to muddy the waters on the science in the minds of the public and policymakers, and thereby delaying action. I mean, we have been pretty confident on the basic science. It's warming, it's us, since the first IPCC report, and that was back in 1990. That's 3.5 decades ago. Imagine if we had sprung into action seriously then.
Yeah.
It's just a fact that I'm very used to, but if you step back and think about it, it's just...
Yeah,
it's
very
madness.
frustrating.
Frustrating, yeah. Indeed, there was a report commissioned by the British government and published in 2006 called the Stern Review. Did you ever hear about that, John? Or
Yeah, I've heard of it.
So the Stern Review aimed to assess the potential economic impacts of climate change and the costs of taking action to mitigate it. Some of the conclusions of the report were that if we continue business as usual, climate change could result in a 5 to 20% loss of GDP each year,
Wow.
year on year.
Year on year.
Year on
That's
year.
insane.
Yes, yeah. I mean that's like to be fair. So I'm not misrepresenting. I think the headline was 5%, and I think in the report it talks about possibly like extreme scenarios where 20%. So it's not 5.
Yeah.
So yeah, just to be fair, 5% is probably more an accurate representation. But even so, the report also suggested that if we acted promptly, the costs of dealing with climate change would equate to 1% of GDP, which, if you ask me, John, sounds like a bit of a bargain.
Yeah.
So there, I must admit, there has been some debate, sometimes heated even, over some of the assumptions used in the Stern report. But no one is seriously suggesting it's cheaper to wait rather than take serious action now. These hard climate deniers, contrarians, who appear so concerned with the economy, seem to, in the end, be advocating for an economy that will eventually be spluttering, if not downright suffocating. I mean, if we looked at the impacts of 2, 3, 4, 5 plus degrees of warming, as we did in episode 8, such is the food, water, disease, weather insecurity, that it's quite frankly hard to imagine a thriving economy. Of course, when you point this all out to the level 6ers down the pub, what do you think then happens, John?
Down the pub. Is that where all of these climate skeptics meet, is it?
Yeah. Yes, that's their den, I guess.
Their hangout.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I feel like I've said the pub several times. I don't know. It's just the kind of average Joe, I guess. But the pub's a lovely place, you know,
Yes,
and yeah. It's, you know what I mean, John. You know what I mean.
Yeah. I do like to take the piss.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I guess maybe they probably cycle round and round and repeat previous arguments and some of the earlier lower levels of the climate skepticism ziggurat arguments.
Yes, that's exactly what happens. The other levels, such as, well, we can't be entirely sure that climate change isn't natural. Or perhaps Jordan Peterson's... I'd love if I could do a Jordan Peterson impression. Shall I have a go? I don't know. We have no idea if reducing...
He just sounds like a sad Kermit the Frog, doesn't he?
Well, people have made that comparison, but yeah, that's... Okay, well, I won't try. I'll just we have no idea if reducing CO2 emissions will do anything anyway. These type arguments rear their ugly head, and you realise just how cynical this wreck the economy argument always was.
Yeah, it's been interesting. I feel like there's some parallels between this kind of way of challenging changes that are happening to what we're seeing in the UK at the moment with the move towards banning smoking.
Okay.
So for those people who aren't aware at the moment, the government is proposing introducing a law where the legal age at which you can smoke will increase year on year. So right. I think basically people that are born after 2009 will never legally be able to buy cigarettes in the UK. Mm-hmm. And obviously this kind of phased rollout of making smoking illegal, you know, it must be a logistical nightmare to make happen, particularly if you're someone who's born in 2008 and you can legally smoke, but your mates can't. But it's almost seen this kind of kickback from the smoking industry, like we saw back in the 70s when there was a great deal of attention being drawn to the harm of smoking. And the argument that it seems to have come back round to is this idea of this is the government trying to take control over your life. Yeah. And if they're going to do it over smoking, where will they stop? where will they go next?
Slippery slope type stuff.
Yeah. This argument does seem to be largely championed by genius politicians like Liz Truss, who, for those of you who aren't aware of UK politics, was our Prime Minister for something like 49 days before she was removed.
44 days.
Yeah. I fortunately managed to be out of the country for the entire time that she was Prime Minister, as we were travelling around Europe at the time, but I was busy following the news, watching the car crash that was the UK back in 2022. Yeah. And so she managed to crash our economy and kill off the Queen, although that might be slightly libelous accusation there. Within just a few days of being Prime Minister. And and so she's a big champion for everyone still being able to smoke. I'll be interested to see how much she receives funding from smoking lobbyist groups. But so the argument that they're taking away your rights and that it's not got anything to do with the immense cost to the NHS of smoking related ill health. So again, there seems like some parallels here with the oil and gas industry, really trying to go, well, we're going to go for the most relevant and the most kind of well supported argument right now, but we can always fall back on those conspiracy theory-esque ideas because there will be some people that those ideas have gained traction amongst.
Yes, they're and I think I think I've mentioned this book before, but Naomi Oreskes, I hope I haven't got the author of that book wrong, but they talk about like the people who were involved in, when it was found out that like tobacco caused cancer, there was a huge issue for the smoking industry, so they hired loads of people to muddy the waters about it's unclear, and apparently the very same people who did that are now doing the same thing with climate change and have been doing it with climate change. So it's literally the same people.
The expert professional bullshit spreaders.
Yes, I'm sure they brand themselves as something else, something equally bullshitty, but essentially that's what they do. And it's just like, how can you look at yourself in the mirror? Or is it just like the human mind has just immense ability to, rationalize whatever? I don't know. But, so, John, something perhaps more profound that gets me about the we shouldn't wreck the economy to save the environment argument. It's almost as if these folks somehow believe that the economy can survive without a healthy, functioning environmental foundation.
Yeah.
So I think Elon Musk has to epitomise this kind of thinking, probably because he just says it out loud. So he said back a few years ago, I think it was, that we can just move to Mars if things go wrong here. Here I'm going to quote the physicist Martin Rees. I think it's a dangerous delusion to believe in mass emigration as Musk does, because nowhere on Mars is as clement as the top of Everest or the South Pole. And dealing with climate change is a real doddle compared to terraforming Mars.
Yeah.
Incidentally, put it in the show notes, but there's a great Kurzgesagt video on how you would terraform Mars. And it's a millennium affair.
Right.
Even with super duper technology. So, anyway, Musk really annoys me. Back in the day, I was like, this dude, he sounds brilliant. He sounds like a genius. Yeah. And then over time, it's given me real trust issues, trusting, people who look like good guys, Yeah, but I feel like a fool for ever buying into it. But so the environment isn't something abstract that's over there, John. The environment's a Jenga tower atop we all sit. We sort of think that with our intelligence, we have conquered nature, that we now call the shots. How profoundly stupid. The environment is our life support system. Its plants produce the oxygen we breathe. Its hydrological cycle delivers the water we drink. Its bees and soil give us the food we eat. Its ozone layer shelters us from the sun's deadly cosmic rays. In case you hadn't noticed, it's cold, dead, and hostile outside the Earth.
Yeah.
The economy in human society sits on an environmental foundation. If that goes wrong, do not be surprised if everything on top does too. On that rather bleak note, John, have you got any good news stories for us this week?
Yes.
Palate, perhaps.
Yeah. Here's the palate cleanser. Yeah, we've got some good news stories. So these are all focusing on a kind of economic bend, because that kind of fits in with the theme of what we've been looking at today. So electric cars, the price of electric cars is continuing to come down. That's one of the big concerns that people have about them, how expensive they are. And their market share keeps rising. So in 2020, around 1 in 25 cars sold worldwide were electric. In 2023, that now reached 1 in 5. And it's predicted that they might make up 90% of the market share by 2030. So that's a massive explosion in electric cars. And, I know you're not a fan, but Musk, is a strong advocate for electric cars. And, he says that the idea that electric cars and the length of their journey, and they're never going to be able to compete with the efficiency of petrol cars, diesel cars, that's a fallacy, and that the batteries are now at the point where they can get to that level. So electric cars really are at the heart of most automakers' strategies for the future. And with rapidly increasing investments going into battery manufacturing, this has made a massive U-turn away from the idea of them being improbable and impractical. Also, clean energy is really benefiting from a whole load of technological innovations, like we talked about in the last episode, that technology is a key part of developing the move away from coal, oil and gas, not just a way of fixing the problems caused by climate change. So there were, particularly during COVID, there were real bottlenecks of supply for critical minerals, such as lithium, that was thought was going to really hamper the production of these EV batteries, particularly, if they're then not sustainably used. But there's quickly been brought to market new battery chemistries that reduce their dependence on key minerals. And innovation is fast moving into other low emission technologies, such as electrolyzers for producing hydrogen and new processes for making green steel as well. So we're seeing lots of things, really, really going on. This really is like the kind of the new frontier of technology and science, making things more sustainable.
And if the people who are worried about wrecking the economy, as in the people who are arguing in bad faith, have had their way, none of this policy would have been put in place that sort of set the stage for all this innovation to happen. So thank God we did something in the last 30 or so years.
And it's like we've talked about before, coal, oil and gas are relics of the past. Really, we're not Luddites, as you say, people who are against new technology. We're fully welcome to embracing new technology, but that new technology is probably more likely going to be green and sustainable. So another key factor at work, and this really kind of links back to what we talked about earlier about the fears around the economic dangers of changing coal, oil and gas, relates to energy security. So the global energy crisis that erupted in 2022 was largely driven by the coal, oil and gas industry and the problems surrounding that. And that's put a huge pressure on the cost of living, and it's really made clear how frail our existing systems are that depend on fossil fuel dominated energy. So this really shows that energy security lies in renewables, nuclear power, energy efficient technologies such as electric cars, heat pumps, because what that does is it reduces the consumer's exposure to volatile fossil fuel prices. If we are dependent upon coal, oil and gas from outside of the UK, we're always going to be far more vulnerable than if we can be generating sustainable, consistent, reliable renewable energy sources within the UK.
Yeah.
So this has led to a real renaissance of industrial policy amongst governments across the world. They're seeking to ensure that economies at the forefront of the new global energy systems that's emerging. So like there's a lot of hope here, this idea that actually, if you really want to be a powerful nation of the future, you need that self-sufficiency. Like for any historians out there, Hitler would have been dead pleased with this idea of, economic autarky and self-sufficiency in the modern world. So, and again, the country that's leading the growth in clean energy is China. And that they've installed as much solar capacity in China in 2023 as the entire world did in 2022. Yeah. So they're comfortably the biggest player in global supply chains for solar panels, wind turbines, electric cars, and other technologies. So regardless of where you stand on climate policy, if countries want to compete with China in the industries of the future, they really need to fully get behind investing and double down on clean energy plans, not dial back on them. And just one final point as well, clean energy is where the jobs are. So as these industries are growing, as there's increased renewables and electric cars and heat pumps, they already account for more than half of employment in the global energy sector, and that's continuing to grow. So really, get on board, get behind it. Otherwise, you're going to be the ones left in the dust.
Yeah, it might become like that. It's very, like if we didn't have all of this, momentum, like climate change would be seriously depressing. But it is a lifeline, and like we may manage to deal with this problem in the long term, without it becoming catastrophic. Yeah. So it is good to hear all that. Sorry, I was a bit negative about Elon Musk. So like, I guess this is part of the reason why I was sort of like quite I don't know how many years ago, maybe in 2015, I think I heard about Musk for the first time, and what he was doing with the, his Tesla and, making EVs cool and everything. And that was really inspirational. And he probably, definitely has, made an impact, a huge impact, and he has been part of the green transition. And because of all that, I guess he doesn't, he's not a climate denier, as I hope I'm not. Someone might point out that he has made climate denial statements, but, because of this background, it's probably insulated him from also becoming a climate denier as well, because he is, prone, he swims in the same waters ideologically with people who are, down a climate denial rabbit hole. So, but what he's done. So Musk has redeeming features, but I guess it's just like the more you learn about him, the more you, you wish you hadn't learned about him, I guess.
Yeah, he can still come across like a cock a lot of the time. But...
fucking all of the time. But, or nearly all of the time. Anyway, I'll can that. Cool. So, in the next 1 or 2 episodes, we'll be covering a few listener questions. So far, we have 2. One from Aaron, who asks about the responsibility of individual countries when it comes to climate change. So, for example, when Germany argues that they needn't do anything because they are only responsible for 2% of global CO2 emissions, just a mere 2%, how should we counter that? And then Millie also asks how we know what the climate was like not tens of thousands of years ago or thousands of years ago, where we've got like ice cores and whatnot and tree rings, but how do we know what the climate was like from like tens of millions of years ago, going back to when the dinosaurs roamed, even as far as that? So if anyone else listening has any burning questions, there's space for us to deal with more questions. So now's the time to email them to us at ccspod280@gmail.com.
Brilliant. Thank you, Mark. So that's it for this episode. Thank you for listening. You can find a link to all the materials we've referenced in the episode in our show notes. We hope you'll join us next time for our listener questions. If you want to know more about the Countering Climate Skepticism podcast, check out the website ccspod.podbean.com. If you've enjoyed the episode, would like to support the show further, you can leave us a review on iTunes, Apple Podcasts, as it's now known. If you want to send us feedback, suggestions for denial, skepticism, contrarian arguments, or ideas for guests, or connect with us on social media, you can do that there. So that's goodbye from me, John Rainier.
And goodbye from me, Mark Prosser.
And we leave you with this quote today from David Suzuki, a Canadian academic and environmental broadcaster. Pollution and climate change by excessive burning of fossil fuels are the real threats, not the people who warn that we must take these threats seriously. We're not the enemy. On that note,
who'd have thought? Who'd have thought?
See you next time. Or ideas for guests, or connect us with social media. Fuck off.
Do we tell the viewers to fuck off?
Okay.